Hello, and welcome to this video, where I will demonstrate the very basics of laying out a page, using Bootstrap in Wappler. A basic layout always starts with semantic HTML elements. In this case, it is a navigation bar, the main content and a footer. Maybe, you wish to include a header. Or even have the navigation bar inside the header. Or, you may prefer to locate the navigation items in a sidebar. It matters not, as long as the semantic elements form a basis of the layout. Why semantic elements? Semantic elements help make web pages more accessible, informative, and adaptable. They also help search engines better interpret content, which can improve a website's online visibility and search engine optimization. On a personal note, I find that semantic elements help me as a developer, to keep track of the page structure and to retain my sanity. For this project, and to keep it simple, I will stick with the original page structure, consisting of a navbar, main content, and a footer. By now, you may have noticed that I'm working within a Node.js project, where the main content is delivered, from content pages to the main layout page. If your project does not contain a templating engine, such as is the case with an HTML page, then you would continue placing the layout elements within the main HTML element. For me, I select the index page to continue inserting the layout elements. For the rest of this video, I have turned the inspect mode on. And I show the Bootstrap Grid. The first element to be inserted is a container. Containers are the most basic layout element in Bootstrap and are required when using the default Bootstrap Grid system. Containers are used to contain, pad, and, sometimes, center the content within them. Bootstrap comes with 3 different containers. Fixed, which is the default, and which sets a maximum width at each responsive breakpoint. Fluid, which is 100% of the width at all breakpoints. Responsive, which is 100% of the width until a specified breakpoint. To illustrate the different containers, I will duplicate the container so that I have 7 containers all up. I leave the first container as the default, fixed container. The second container is converted to a fluid container. The remaining containers are made responsive, with each one being allocated a different breakpoint. Resizing the viewport shows the response of each of the responsive containers. Continuing with the default container, it is worth noting that we can put content inside of it. This still follows the definition of a container. Placing content directly into a container means having just the one column to house the content. This may be okay for smaller devices where the real estate is limited in width, or for documents, like the privacy policy. But, for a more diverse content on larger screens, the likelihood of a multiple column layout is imperative. Enter the Bootstrap Grid. Bootstrap's grid system uses a series of containers, rows, and columns to lay out and align content. It's built with Flexbox and is fully responsive. To understand the basics. Container is for content and serves as a wrapper for grid rows. Row needs to be nested inside a container and serves as a wrapper for grid columns. Column needs to be nested inside a row and is for content. To illustrate, I now add a row inside the container after the paragraph. Here we notice the appearance of vertical columns and a purple colored division. The purple color denotes that the element is a flex container. The vertical columns are part of the Bootstrap Grid system. The width of each vertical column has a unit of measure of 1 col, col. There are 12 such cols, making the total width of the grid row 12 cols. Inside the row, I add a column. Here we notice that the column has a width of 12 cols, with a left and right padding. Inside the column, I add a heading and a paragraph, imitating the content that is inside the container. When I select the container, we see that the column has the exact same padding as the container. Without going into the technical details, this is the row doing its job. That is why it is important to stress the container, row, and column combination. Now that we have a basic understanding of the Bootstrap Grid system, let me show a few examples of how this can be put to use. I start with a new page layout, where I have 5 containers, each with a heading. To illustrate a basic grid, I add a row after the first heading. Inside the row, I add a column. This column occupies the full 12 calls of the grid. As I duplicate the column widths resize to equally divide the available space. Having 4 columns, each column occupies 3 grid calls, totaling 12 calls all up. When we view the result in mobile view, we see that the last column has dropped down, and now occupies the full 12 calls. This is because the grid is responsive. But it does not look great. Later on I will show you how to overcome this for smaller screen sizes. This example shows columns of equal width. But what if we want to specify the width of each column individually? To save time, I'll copy the first row, and drag it down to below the second heading. Selecting the first column, I give it a size of 6 calls. Then, I assign a width of 3 calls to each of the next 2 columns. This adds up to 12 calls all up. The 4th column is removed. Viewing the layout in mobile view shows that the columns remain on the same line. However, they are somewhat squashed up. Again, not a great result. To fix this, we can use responsive column widths. I have gone ahead and copied the previous row and dragged it to below the next heading. The first step is to remove the current widths on each of the columns. Then I select the mobile landscape view. The columns in this view all get a width of 4 calls. Next comes the laptop view, where the first column gets a width of 6, and the remaining columns get a width of 3 calls. Going to mobile view, we see that the elements are stacked. Unfortunately, there is no space between the columns. To fix this, I select the row, and scroll down to spacing. Here I set the vertical gutter to a spacing of 4. This provides the required spacing. We now see a single column for mobile view, equal column widths for small devices, and a larger first column in larger devices. The next section deals with horizontal placement of columns. Once again, I have placed a copy of the previous grid after the next heading. I start by deleting the first column. This leaves us with 2 columns that do not occupy the full width of the row. There are several alternatives to move these columns along the horizontal axis. The first is to apply a column offset. For this, I select the first column, and in the Properties panel, I set the offset to 3 calls to center the columns, or 6 calls to move them to the right. Of course, you can use the other values to offset the columns at various positions. The second method requires setting a margin. Using margins, the placement can be even more incremental than using the column offset method. However, to keep it simple, I will only show the center and right align positions. To right align, I select the first column and scroll down to spacing. Here I set the left margin to auto. This has pushed the containers to the right side of the row. To center the containers, I select the second column, and set the right margin to auto. The third method makes use of the flex container. I select the row as the flex container. Under horizontal align in the layout section, I choose center. As expected, this centers the columns. Choosing end align sends the columns to the right. There are also a couple of other alignment options, as I show here. For this last section, I add a row and a column. Inside the column, I add an image. For a static page, I would have as many columns as there are images. But, in this case, I will pretend to dynamically load the images from a database query. For this purpose, I select the row and convert it to repeat the columns, otherwise known as children. Then I assume that there will be 11 images coming from the query. As you can see, this has neatly placed 11 images in the row. Going to mobile view, the cramped up images is not a good look. Here I introduce another responsive setting called row columns. Setting this to 2 columns gives me 2 images per physical row. Now, don't be confused. There are still 11 images within the Bootstrap row. This is just a distinction between a physical row and a Bootstrap row. Moving on, I select the next view and set the number of columns to 3. The other views get the same treatment of the number of columns that need to be shown per physical row. Notice the absence of the unit of measure, called cols? Now that the layout of the images has been sorted, we see that there is no space between the physical rows. To rectify this, I turn to our friend, gutters. I set the vertical gutter margin to 3. But I also change the horizontal gutter from its default value of 4, to match the vertical gutter margin. And there we have it. This has shown the basics of the Bootstrap Grid system to lay out our pages. I hope that this has been helpful. Thank you for watching.